People still joining?
Yes.
I've got. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. I think we will start now. Just to welcome you all to the latest of our Harif lockdown lectures. Harif, for those who haven't heard of us, is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We're based in England, and we do a similar sort of job to Jimena, if you're familiar with Jimena in California. We try to raise awareness of the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We try and advocate for their rights. We also try and advocate for other minorities. Check out our website, www.harif.org, and our associated blog, Point of No Return. The subject of this evening's talk is lifting the veil on Jewish life in Iran. And I am very delighted to introduce Karmel Melamed, who is a journalist. He writes for The Forward, for the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles. He is the go-to expert on Iranian Jewry, and he feels very passionate about it. So the format for this evening is that Karmel will give us a sort of potted history of the Jewish community in Iran. Then we have prepared some questions which I will ask Karmel. And of course, if you have questions of your own, which on subjects that we haven't covered, you're welcome to type in your question in the chat. Just press the button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to ask those questions for you. Just to say, this evening is being live streamed on the Harif Facebook page, and it'll be up there for you to watch whenever you like. And if anyone has missed this talk, they can, of course, catch up on the Harif Facebook page. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Karmel Melamed.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you to Harif and to Jimena for hosting this event. It's a great honor for me to share some of the history of Iranian Jewry and to hopefully open some eyes about what's going on with the Jews in Iran today and what this regime has been doing vis-a-vis the Jewish community for the last 41 years. It's a beautiful, beautiful community, amazing history, and I just think folks need to educate themselves and, as you said, remove the veil and get involved and learn more about what's happening in Iran to the Jews and what this regime has in store for not just the Jews in Iran, but Jews worldwide. So if you want to go to our first slide. So the previous one, please.
Sorry.
So this is the...
That's first slide.
Yeah.
Here we go. Yes, the first one. So this is the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And the story of Iran's Jews really begins with the destruction of the first temple, Solomon's temple, in 586 BC, when the Jews were taken from Judea, enslaved by the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, and taken to what is today modern-day Iran and Iraq. And they lived there for 70 years under captivity of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. So the Jewish community in Iran and also in Iraq are perhaps one of the most oldest Jewish communities in the world. We have 2,700 years of continuous habitation in what is today modern Iran and Iraq. And folks always ask, you know, where do the Iranian Jews come from? We trace our roots all the way back to the destruction of the first temple of Solomon in 586. So this is the start of how Jews began to live in that part of the world. Next. So as it said in the Bible, the Babylonian exile ended with Cyrus the Great. Cyrus conquers Babylonia, what is today modern day Iran and Iraq, in 539 BC. And essentially, Cyrus frees the Jews, allows them to return back to Judea, Israel, to rebuild their temple. But still, you have a number of Jews who remained. They remained in Babylonia, they remained in Persia, the ancient Persian Empire, and they lived, they thrived. Cyrus is, you know, considered one of the most revered non-Jewish individuals in the Torah and the Bible for what he did as far as his emancipation of the Jews and really giving them freedom of religion and all peoples that the Persian Empire controlled under his empire. So Cyrus is perhaps one of the most important folks, you could say, one of the sources in Iranian Jewish history, a great source of pride for Iranian Jews, but also a great source of pride for Iranians in general, because he set forth what we have today as, you know, the modern human rights. His famous cylinder is available in the British Museum. There's a replica at the United Nations. This is an incredible milestone in world history and a great source of pride for all Iranians, for that matter. And the Jews really began to thrive under Cyrus and under the subsequent Archimede kings in his dynasty. Next slide. There we go. This is the tomb of Esther and Mordechai located in the Iranian city of Hamadan. So when we think of Persian Jews, Iranian Jews, immediately Esther and Mordechai come to mind. The story of Purim, the book of Esther, and I won't get into the whole story of it, but basically the Jews were living in the Persian Empire, and Esther, who was the Persian Jewish queen, saved the Jews of the world and the Jews of Persia. And this is supposedly her tomb and her uncle's tomb, Mordechai in Hamadan. Now, the thing that's interesting is there is no scientific verification that this is indeed the tomb. Folklore, the community in Iran has always revered the site as the tomb. Historically, scientifically, it has not been proven that it is the tomb. But still, it holds a tremendous amount of reverence for Iranian Jews because of Esther and Mordechai's importance in Judaism and in the Bible. Recently, it was under attack, not the tomb itself, but a synagogue that was adjacent to it last month was under attack by a fire attack. The information regarding that attack is still up in the air. Folks don't really know, but there's suspicion that the regime's thugs may have been somewhat involved in it. Next slide. So this is the inside of the tomb itself. Again, no one really knows if they are indeed in there. The first knowledge of, or recordation, historic recordation of this being the tomb of Esther and Mordechai came from Rabbi Benjamin of Toledo in 1167 CE. He was traveling through, he was a Spanish scholar, Spanish Jewish scholar. He was traveling through the Middle East, and the first records of him, any records of this being a tomb was recorded by him, historically speaking. Now, of course, the Jews of Iran, the Jews of Hamadan will, say they'll disagree with that. I interviewed in 2005 the late Professor Amnon Netzer. He was a professor at Hebrew University in Israel regarding the tomb, and he believed that this was actually the tomb of Shushandoch, who was the Jewish wife of one of the Iranian kings, Yazgerd I. That was his belief and some of the beliefs of some of the Iranian Jewish scholars. Again, it's up in the air, but the site has tremendous amount of reverence and importance to Iranian Jews. Next slide, please. So Iran is home to a number of very, very important Jewish sites in Judaism. This is actually the site of the tomb of the prophet Daniel. It's located in southwestern Iran in a city called Shusha. And actually, after the Islamic conquest, years after the Islamic conquest of Iran, the folks that were maintaining this region revered Daniel, and they believed that this was his tomb, and they built a mosque. And both Jews and Muslims make pilgrimage to the mosque and visit it, and it's a very important site. Now you'll have a number of our Iraqi Jewish friends that will say, they'll disagree that this is the site of Daniel's tomb. They believe the site of Daniel's tomb is really in Mosul in Iraq. I won't get into that argument, but this is one of the important Jewish sites in Iran of Daniel, the prophet. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of the ghetto, popularly known by Iranian Jews, the Jewish ghetto in Tehran at the turn of the 20th century, popularly known by Iranian Jews as the Mahalleh, or the ghetto. We're basically going to fast forward from ancient history, Iranian Jewish history, to modern history, because it's really expensive and our time is really limited this evening. What's important to know with regards to the Jewish ghetto is after the Arab and Muslim conquest of Iran from 633 to 654 AD, the Jews and other religious minorities, Christians, Zoroastrians, they were relegated to live in ghettos or slums. They were prohibited from living amongst the population. They were prohibited from having access to certain jobs. They were prohibited from major interaction with the larger Muslim population because they were essentially dhimis, the term that in Arabic which is used for the tolerated other religions. Iran followed unlike the other Arab countries, Iran followed the Shiite Islamic dogma or religion, and placed the Jews in these ghettos and endured tremendous persecution for centuries. Throughout the years, the Jews were forced to convert in many instances under pressure of death. A lot of times, many of them converted out of convenience. They were tired of living in poverty. They were tired of living in fear. There were scores of massacres, forced conversions, rapes, pogroms, and basically the Jews lived in fear day by day in ways throughout Iran. I think perhaps one of the most horrific pogroms or violent attacks of the Jews in previous centuries came in 1839 in the city of Mashhad. It's a popular uprising known as the Al-Adad, where basically the Muslim thugs or strongmen in the city started a riot. They were supposedly insulted by an incident involving the Jews, and they were rioting, looting, killing of Jews, and they went to, thousands of Jews, and they basically put knives to their throats and said, convert or die. And many hundreds did convert. They took on Muslim names, they left the ghettos, and they became Muslims. A number of those Jews converted, but they remained crypto-Jews. They still practiced Judaism in the home, still kept kashrut in the home. They married amongst one another because they knew one another were from Jewish families, but outwardly they were Muslim to the Muslim population, often went to the mosques if need be, to basically save their lives. They lived as similarly to those Spanish Jews known as the Marranos for quite a while. Now, a number of Jews from Mashhad who faced this persecution fled Mashhad and went to Herat in Afghanistan. So a portion of the Afghan Jewish community originates from Mashhad. Next slide, please. So this is Reza Shah Pahlavi. In 1925, he deposed the previous Qajar dynasty, and he heralded an enormous amount of modernization for Iran, and he is perhaps one of the most beloved kings of Iran for Iranian Jews, because he emancipated the Jews of Iran and the other religious minorities for that matter. He was a heavy nationalist, and he wanted to do away with a lot of the backwards Islamic dogma that was holding the country back, and really giving freedom to all Iranians, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, and to reinforce a sense of nationalism and a desire for the country to come into the modern era, modernize. He literally pulled Iran out of poverty. And I say he's beloved because the generation of Jews that grew up during his era encountered a tremendous amount of freedoms and opportunities. He allowed the Jews to leave their various ghettos. He allowed the Jews to obtain higher education. In many instances, he himself and his government funded the education of Jews to European and Western countries for higher education. he was the emancipator for Jews in the 20th century, greatly loved and revered and respected. Next slide. So this is a snapshot of the one of the Jewish Zionist groups in early 20th century. And here you see these group of gentlemen are very well dressed. They have suits. They're quite educated. And it reflects the Jews coming out of that poverty, that sense of poverty. Now, I'm not saying that life was fantastic after Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power. The Jews still faced a lot of discrimination in Iran. Things weren't, 100% rosy, but the situation of Jews improved tremendously because they were now able to leave their ghettos, obtain higher education, get involved in some of the trades, really survive and thrive. They obtained education through the Alliance Israélite. It was a European Jewish school that was set up in various cities in Iran. And we'll get into the Alliance a little bit further down. But the Alliance really gave Jews in Iran Iranian education, the ability to read, write, and also Jewish education, Hebrew, learning Hebrew, reading and writing, and likewise language skills, foreign language skills such as English and French. And it really allowed the Jews in the early 20th century to gradually rise out of extreme poverty and gain a little bit of sustenance and some freedoms. And they began to get involved with movements such as the Zionist movement, the creation of a Jewish state eventually to be set up in Israel. Next slide, please. So this is a photo of Elias Essarian. Elias Essarian was the head of all of the Alliance schools in Iran. He passed away several years ago, and I had an opportunity to interview him. And he really shed light on why the Jews of Iran under the Pahlavi kings were able to thrive and have success was in large part to the Alliance schools. A little bit of history for folks with regards to the Alliance schools. The Alliance Israélite Universelle was a nonprofit Jewish European organization set up in 1860 by European Jewish philanthropists such as Montefiore and Rothschild and other very affluent European Jews. They decided that they wanted to help their co-religionist brethren in the Muslim and Arab lands. And the best way they could do that was to set up schools to provide education for these Jews that were living in abject poverty. And hopefully by gaining education, they'd be able to get into the trades, they'd be able to get into commerce and gradually lift themselves up. Now, the Alliance schools were allowed into many of the Arab countries over the years, North Africa and much of the Middle East, except for Iran. The Iranian Shiite kings under the Qajar dynasty were vehemently anti-Semitic. They did not want the Jews to prosper or gain any kind of advantage. And it wasn't until 1898 when Nasr al-Din Shah, one of the Qajar kings, eventually was bribed by some of the Alliance leadership and sweet-talked and persuaded to allow the Alliance schools to be set up in one of the cities in Iran on the condition that Muslim students would be allowed to enjoy some of that education as well. Nasr al-Din Shah was assassinated and shortly thereafter, but his son Muzaffar al-Din Shah allowed the Alliance schools to continue in a limited manner. But the Alliance schools continued at the turn of the 20th century, and then under the Pahlavi kings, they thrived, and they were in many of the major cities throughout Iran, and they literally grabbed these children who were living in abject poverty, provided them with not only education, in many instances, clothing, shoes, books, sometimes in some instances vaccination, helping to clean them up, really giving these children a sense of hope and future. In many instances, the parents were resistant to their children gaining education through the Alliance, and it wasn't because of their opposition to the Alliance, but it was because children for centuries throughout Iran in Jewish and non-Jewish Jewish and non-Jewish families were required to work with the family in whatever trade to feed the family. And when these children were taken into the schools, it was one less person that was able to help the family feed itself. So there was some resistance in the beginning, but gradually the parents realized the importance of the Alliance schools, and the Alliance schools really thrived under the Pahlavis and allowed at least 2 generations of Jews to improve their lives. A number of Iranian Jews today who live in Iran, in the United States, in Europe, and Israel credit the Alliance schools for helping their parents to pull themselves out of poverty, get education. Sometimes after they left the Alliance schools, they went off to Europe or America to gain higher education. But the importance of the Alliance schools cannot be underscored in really transforming the lives of Iranian Jews in the 20th century, and they continued up until 1979, the Iranian Revolution. Next slide, please. So these are the Elghanian brothers. In the direct center is Habib Elghanian, who was the head of the Iranian Jewish community up until 1979, from the mid-60s up until 1979. And the Elghanians are an example of the middle-class Jewish community in Iran that rose as a result of Reza Shah and his son, Mohammad Reza Shah's emancipation of the Jews and really allowing them to get education, to get into commerce and trade, and really thrive. Now, again, I don't want to paint a rosy picture. Anti-Semitism did exist in Iran during this time. There were many people that were biased. There were many people in the government at the time that resisted the Jews gaining prominence and education. But for the most part, the government did not persecute the Jews. They protected them. They created a sense of tolerance, and they allowed the Jews, such as the Elghanians, to thrive. And as a result, Iran thrived. Many of the Jews were of the new middle and upper class were merchants, were importing goods. They were starting factories. They had obtained education in Europe and America. They were importing machinery to develop products in Iran, hiring scores and scores of folks in their factories and really helping to improve the life and modernization of Iran. And there was huge, huge improvement to life in Iran, and the Jews were critical in helping to modernize and help Iran thrive and develop. And the Elghanians were just one family, and they were very prominent and very successful because of the various businesses that they developed, bringing in factories that were creating refrigerators, raw material, steel pipes, various manufacturing assets. There were other Jews in this class of merchants that were involved in textiles, importing textiles, importing electronics, televisions, radios, a whole host of trades. Next slide, please. This is the Plasco, the former Plasco building built in 1962 by the brothers. It became the first skyscraper in modern Iran, being 17 stories. Today we think of 17 stories not as a skyscraper, but for 1962 Iran, in Tehran, this was a pretty huge endeavor. And it was a real milestone, really, for the Jews of Iran to show that, you know, they were a part of the country. They were an important asset. They were helping to improve the lives of everyone in the country, and they were a part of the modernization and the Shah's effort to really build the country and bring it out of that third world status. But this was a huge, huge landmark. Unfortunately, about 3 years ago, the Plasco building collapsed in a horrific fire as a result of mismanagement by the Iranian regime. The regime had confiscated the building after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, not from the Elghanians, but from the owner that was a Baha'i gentleman that had purchased the building from the Elghanians. And unfortunately, a number of people lost their lives in the Plasco building disaster. But it was really a symbol of what the Jews had achieved in Iran under the Pahlavis after gaining education, after gaining an opportunity to really thrive. Next slide, please. This is Dr. Iraj Lalazari. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was an example of the Iranian Jews that really thrived in academia. He was one of the foremost Iranian chemists and pharmacologists. He had obtained higher education in Europe. He was world-renowned. He received the Lavoisier Medal from the official French Chemical Foundation or Institute. You'll have to forgive me, I don't remember the exact name of it, but he was one of the most respected and well-revered Iranian academics and scientists in Iran by Jews and non-Jews alike. It's just an example, again, of the Jews thriving in the field of academia, in the sciences, and really contributing to the prestige of Iran in general, and helping humanity for that matter. And in subsequent years, he was forced to flee Iran because of his Jewish religion. And he immigrated to the United States, and he continued his research, and he was still revered. He was still respected worldwide. And it was a disastrous loss for the Iranian nation, but unfortunately the new regime did not have any tolerance for the Jews in academia. Next slide, please. These are the Nazarian Brothers. On the left is Yunus, and on the right is Parviz. Yunus passed away, I believe, a year or two ago. But these gentlemen were again amongst the generation of those Jews who had lifted themselves up from abject poverty and gone into business, and then in turn helped in philanthropy in the Jewish community in Iran and in Israel, and subsequently in America. The Nazarians were an example of how the Iranian Jews helped to facilitate business relations and trade between Israel and Iran in the late 50s and all the way up to 1979. The Shah's regime or Shah's government did not have official ties or recognition with Israel, but they did have de facto relations with Israel. They did quite a bit of trade, and the Jews were a big part of helping to facilitate business and trade and cultural exchanges and music exchanges. And the Nazarians company, the company they owned and started was called Techno-Is, which was short for Technology of Israel. And they imported construction equipment from Israel, from Europe, and from America. And they sold that construction equipment to government officials that were helping to build Iran's infrastructure, and also to the private sector that was involved with building infrastructure in Iran. And in subsequent there you go. In subsequent years, they fled Iran as a result of the revolution. They came to the United States. They immigrated to the United States. They were involved again in manufacturing in the aerospace sector, but they were also the founders and the financiers of the telecommunications company Qualcomm, which is well known worldwide. Qualcomm is involved with the cell phone technology that we all use and enjoy. And it came from the Nazarians' investment and their involvement with technology. So they are an example of how Jews thrived in Iran, and unfortunately the country suffered as a result of their fleeing, and in turn the US benefited from their business savvy and from their entrepreneurship. It was, again, a devastating loss for Iran, but it just showed that the success of Iranians in business and as far as being merchants. Next slide, please. A huge part of the success of Iranian Jews in the 20th century came from the Shah himself, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He is, again, revered like his father. He was a protector of the Jews of Iran, and in turn, they were, for the most part, they were respectful of him. They had a deep love and appreciation for him because, again, he had allowed them to thrive. He had allowed them to gain education and really lift themselves up from their precarious situations. He attained power in 1941 after his father was forced to abdicate. And from 41 to 79, he really protected the Jews and other religious minorities, for that matter, Christians, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, and other folks that were not Muslim. The Ayatollahs, the clerics, feared the Shah, feared his regime, and they really refrained from the attacks that they had made on the Jews in the previous dynasty under the Qajars. So the Shah, you know, without a doubt, he was a dictator. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but he was someone that really helped to improve the lives of the Jews, allow them to prosper, allow them to grow, and really improve their lives from what their lives were like previously. In my humble opinion, the Pahlavi dynasty and the Archimedes under Cyrus the Great were perhaps the greatest kings to the Jews as far as their behavior, as far as the tolerance that they created. Was anti-Semitism in Iran? Did anti-Semitism exist during his reign? Absolutely. Were there people that were discriminatory against Jews? Absolutely. There's no way, you know, I'm not going to sugarcoat that. But for the most part, it was an atmosphere of relative peace, tranquility, prosperity for the Jews and the majority of Iranians, for that matter. Next slide. This is Dr. Mousa Beroukhim. He was one of the foremost French linguists, French professor of French language, French literature in Tehran and in Iran, for that matter. He was a professor at Tehran University of French language. He is my uncle, my late uncle, I should say, by marriage. He married my aunt. But the reason I featured him is not because he's a relative, but because he was an example of, again, an individual, a Jew who was living in the Jewish ghetto in Tehran and under privileged, horrific conditions, extreme poverty, and was able to pull himself out of that situation by going to the Alliance schools and then subsequently going to France and obtaining his PhD in French language and French literature with the scholarship from Reza Shah, the Shah's father, and subsequently returning back to Iran and providing that French language education and knowledge to Iranians in the world of academia, and then also to the military folks, the intelligentsia in Iran. He was also involved with a number of publications. He was a journalist. He wrote for the Journal de Tehran, which was a French language newspaper published in Iran. And he's an example of how Jews were able to help build bridges with Europe and really educate Iranians and speed up the modernization process. Again, unfortunately, he left Iran a little bit prior to the revolution, but folks like him were an example of how Jews thrived in Iran during the Pahlavis and really excelled in academia and in their, you know, in their rising up, help the country as well. Next slide. This is Soleiman Haiim. He was the first creator of the first English to Farsi language. Again, contributed to the betterment of Iranian society by developing a dictionary which was used widely, not only by folks in government, but folks in academia, thousands and thousands of students that were going overseas that needed to learn English, that needed a dictionary while they were obtaining higher education in Europe and in America. Haiim gave them that key. And many people do not know that the modern English to Farsi dictionary and Farsi to English dictionary was developed by a Jew, an Iranian Jew, published and subsequently published by Jews. So he developed it, and then the publishers of the dictionary were also Jews. It's a family called the Beroukhim family. So the Jews were really instrumental for helping Iran in the sphere of education. And to this day, Haiim's dictionary is still used in Iran. Unfortunately, the regime has removed his name in many instances, failed to give him credit, taken the royalties from publication of the dictionary for themselves, and really denied him and the family the respect that they deserve. Earlier this year, he was honored by the Iranian Jewish community here in Los Angeles for his contributions, not just to Jewish life in Iran, but to all modern life in Iran. Dare I say, many of the Iranian regime's diplomats, like Zarif, without a doubt used Haiim's dictionary and benefited from his work. And this was by no means a small feat. Next slide. Dr. Samuel Rahbar, again, another incredible scientist in the field of researching for diabetes and specifically hemoglobin in the blood. In Iran, he received a number of national awards from the Shah. Again, one of the huge scientists in Iran for his contributions to science and medical research. Again, forced to flee the country because the Ayatollah Khomeini regime was not tolerant of the Jews being in any kind of status position in Iran above Muslims, and could not tolerate them in the fields of academia and science. But Dr. Rahbar, who passed away in recent years, he was so respected internationally that when he came to the United States, he immigrated to the United States, he was immediately hired as a researcher at the world-renowned City of Hope Medical Research Center here in Southern California. And those that know the City of Hope know that they are in the cornerstone of a number of cancer research, research related to diabetes and other diseases that are afflicting the world. So Dr. Rahbar, again, a huge example of Iranian Jews thriving in Iran and unfortunately being forced to flee the country. And again, Iranian Jewish gems, in my opinion. Next slide, please. So what was the calamity for the Jews in the 20th century was the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The Shah's regime was deposed by the Ayatollah Khomeini. I'm really not going to get into the politics of what happened. You know, we'll leave that to the politicians and the historians. But what's important to note is that when the Shah was deposed, a lot of the protections and the freedoms that he gave to the Jews dissipated overnight. The Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, swept away any of the quote-unquote protections that the Jews enjoyed under the Shah, removed a lot of the tolerance that the Jews enjoyed from government and from, you know, folks in the private sector, and really relegated the Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians to a third-class, so to say, status. The Ayatollah's regime implemented strict Sharia law under Shiite Islamic dogma, and gradually implemented a process of persecution of the Jews, execution of the Jewish leader Habib Elghanian, and really creating an environment of hostility and fear for the Jews, where they could no longer live and live in peace and thrive and just practice their religion and live normal lives. They were in constant fear for their lives and for their livelihoods. It was a huge tragedy. Next slide, please. So folks often ask me what that caused Jews to flee Iran, the revolution, and most likely than not, it was the execution of Habib Elghanian in May of 1979. Elghanian was the Jewish community leader. He had left Iran when the revolution, the uprising started, but he subsequently returned to Iran because he felt that he was the shepherd of the community. He was the leader of the community. He was the protector of the community, and he wanted to help. Unfortunately, the new regime tied him with the Shah's regime. They arrested him. They charged him with bogus charges of spying for America and Israel. They put on a 20-minute sham accusing him of everything under the sun, and executed him in May of 1979. And the newspaper clipping right there on your right-hand side is the headlines stating that he was executed. And when he was executed, it sent a huge message to the Jews of Iran that you are no longer welcomed in the Iranian regime under the Ayatollah Khomeini. And your place is as third-class citizens. Don't think that you can get away with what you were doing before. What happened with that slide? There we go. After his execution, scores of Jews fled Iran, many of them not able to sell their properties, their assets, their businesses. They just fled the country out of fear. They knew that if the Jewish community leader was executed randomly on such false and fabricated charges, their lives were also in danger. And so they fled Iran. Some of them were able to sell their assets and businesses and their properties, but at bargain, dropped everything and fled overnight. Some folks remained, and they kind of discounted the execution. That he was involved with the regime, and as a result, the regime of the Ayatollah wanted a message, and they've sent a message, but the Jews aren't under that much of a threat. So some folks stayed, but really the execution of Elghanian for no reason was the spark that caused Jews to start from Iran and realize that their lives were not as protected as they used to be. Next slide, please. Elghanian was executed by Ayatollah Sadegh Khali, this is his picture here. And Khali was not only involved with executing the Iranian Jewish leader Elghanian, but many of the opponents of the Shah's regime. As you can see here, some of the bodies of the opponents of the regime, folks that were involved with the Shah's government, military folks involved in the Shah's government, communists that were opposed the Ayatollah Khomeini's regime, anyone else that deemed enemies of the state were ordered to be executed by Khali. Ordered folk under really false and fabricated charges. This is, we missed a slide there. Next slide, please. This is a gentleman by the name of Albert Danielpour. Earlier this week on June the 5th, we celebrated, or not celebrated, my apologies, we commemorated his killing. He was the second Jew that was executed by the Iranian regime for no reason. He was just a businessman. He was arrested in early 1979. The family handed over his businesses, his assets. He was released again in January 1980. He was arrested again randomly and charged with being a Zionist spy, just fabricated false charges from January of 1980 until June of 1980. He was imprisoned and repeatedly tortured, physically tortured, emotionally tortured, psychologically tortured. He suffered a heart attack in between the sessions of being tortured. And finally, I'm not going to get into some of the details of his execution, but he was eventually executed on false charges of being a spy for Israel. And again, Khalili ordered his execution in June of 1980. Next slide. This is the late Mousa Beroukhim, the third Jew that was executed by the regime. He was actually one of my relatives. Again, charged with being a Zionist spy and executed in July of 1980. He had no ties to the Shah's regime. He was not political. He was just a 30-year-old wealthy Jewish businessman, and the regime wanted to confiscate his assets. And they put him in front of the firing squad. They shot him point blank in the heart. My father was responsible for retrieving his body. His whole family had fled Iran, and the ordeal of retrieving his body and giving him a kosher burial was something that was traumatic for our family, and something that we can get into a little bit later on. But again, an example of how randomly and without any reason the regime executed Jews. Next slide. Another Jew executed by the regime was this gentleman, Mr. Ghedooshim, again, another leader, community leader of the Jewish community in Isfahan, not tied with the Shah's regime, not political, and again, arrested, tortured, and executed in September of 1981. I'm showing just a few of these folks for individuals to realize that there's some real faces. These folks were fathers, husbands, uncles, brothers. They had families. They were real individuals and Jews that suffered as a result of the brutality of the Iranian regime. And in the last 41 years, roughly 24 Jews have been killed by the regime in Iran. And they have real faces. They have real names. Their stories are heartbreaking and horrific. And we as Jews and non-Jews and lovers of humanity need to acknowledge what happened. The Iranian regime accountable for, these horrific crimes. Next slide. This is Parviz Yeshaya. He is one of the Jewish community leaders in Iran today. He's not the Jewish community leader in Iran, but he was one of the folks that really took up a lead. Many of the leaders of the Jewish community in Iran had fled the country for various reasons, want to remain in the country. And Yeshaya was one of those folks position, embrace the new regime, embrace the fact that part of this new Iranian Revolution, and he is still in Iran. He's not one of the main leaders, but he's still involved and being a parrot and a puppet. Iran is concerned. Next slide, please. This is of the regime. Folks think that, you know, he says what he says against Israel because he doesn't want to endanger the lives of the Jews. There are other folks that say that, no, he is. There are other folks that say that are fabulous and great, and the Jews live in, you know, safety. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I apologize for the quality. Carmel, just finish your. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. This is the last slide in the lower left-hand corner. A writing on the wall in Iran. It says anyone who doesn't pay his religion. This is reflective of the Iranian regime's treatment of the Jews and the high level of anti-Semitism that exists in Iran today with the regime. They claim to be protective of the Jews. They claim to provide to the Jews, but in reality, there is a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism and hostility to the Jews. And even if you look at the basic laws of, you know, that are instilled in the Iranian regime's constitution, as an example, Article 4 of the regime implements Sharia law, Shiite Islamic Sharia law. And Sharia law requires discrimination of non-Muslims, including Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians. Article 19 of the Constitution denies equal rights to non-Muslims. There's a long list of just civil and criminal laws that prohibit Jews and non-Muslims from having equal rights in Iran. And the Jews have basically lived in as third-class citizens, I should say. Another law which is really outrageous in Iran is that if a non-Muslim, for example, a Jew, converts to Islam, his family does not, his parents or the folks that he's supposed to inherit, their assets from at death, he would inherit all of their assets, and the Jewish heirs would receive nothing. He would inherit all of them because he's converted to Islam. These are, the various laws, discriminatory laws against the Jews. There are other laws that prohibit the teaching of Hebrew language, even for religious purposes in Iran. Jewish prayer books cannot be printed in Iran without the permission of the regime, and the regime hasn't given permission of printing even prayer books in Hebrew. So it's a long list of just horrific discrimination and anti-Semitism that the Jews have faced in Iran. There are many folks, I'm going to end with this note, there are many folks that claim that the Jews live fantastic lives, it's a great utopia for Jews in Iran, but they forget the fact that in 1979, there were 80,000 Jews that lived in Iran. But today, only 5,000 to 8,000 Jews live in Iran. And my comment and my response to those that claim that life is great for the Jews and fantastic in Iran is, if life is so great, then why did the Jewish population decrease so substantially in the last 41 years, where only 5,000 to 8,000 Jews live there? It's a question that they can never answer. And the reality is, because life is not great for the Jews that are living in Iran, and the vast majority have left the country. And to that, I will hand it over to you, Lynn, and
Okay.
questions, and other folks can ask some questions.
Right. Can you hear me, everybody? Can you hear me? Yes? Good. Well, I just wanted to thank Carmel for that fantastic kind of overview of the Jewish community right up until the present day. I do apologize for the sound quality. I'm afraid we did lose you from time to time, but that is really beyond our control.
It's in America, the problem,
yeah.
not in the UK. For once.
Yeah, could be America. Anyway, I just wanted to ask you, Carmel, have you got your video on? Hang on. Can't see. Oh, okay, yeah. So we're saving on bandwidth here. So I would just ask it to your blank screen. What is your personal story, Carmel? Because I know you were born in Iran. How did you get out of there?
I was born in September of 1978 in the cusp of the revolution. My family did not want to leave Iran. Iran was our home. Our ancestors lived there for generations and for centuries. Really, the breaking point for us was when they executed Habib Beroukhim, who we saw his picture in the slide presentation. They arrested him. They executed him. His whole family had fled the country, and my father was one of two individuals that went to get his body from the morgue in the Evin prison in Iran, in Tehran, and they would not release the body to my father. The folks in the morgue demanded a 50,000 rial, or Iranian currency, payment for the bullet that they had used to execute him. And with great difficulty, my father and the other gentleman, name was Morad Chaman, the two of them found the money, paid for the bullet, obtained the body, gave him a kosher burial, and within a couple of weeks, we fled Iran on one of the last flights out of the country. And my father was so traumatized because of seeing the execution and the brutality of the regime, and Beroukhim's body, which had obviously been tortured before he was shot point blank in the heart, that he realized that Iran was no longer a safe place for us, even though we were, our family was not politically involved with the Shah's regime. It finally dawned on my parents and my family that we had to leave the country. And so sadly, his execution was what sparked our exodus out of the country.
Right. And how did people leave after it was no longer possible to take flights out of Iran?
The primary way was through illegal crossings with the help of smugglers out of Turkey or out of Pakistan. Jews paid exorbitant amounts of money to smugglers. There were smugglers of opium, smugglers of, various alcohol and other items across the border to Turkey or across the border to Pakistan, who took Jews. Sometimes they didn't know that they were taking Jews. They just received exorbitant amounts of money to smuggle these folks out of Iran, and they escaped Iran, in that method. In the years subsequently, and this was primarily during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, when immigration of Jews or anyone else out of Iran was strictly prohibited because of the war with Iraq. After 1988, gradually, the regime kind of looked the other way while Jews left the country quietly. There was no publicity made of it because it would have been embarrassing to the regime for Jews to be leaving. And with the help of Jewish organizations like Hayas, the Jews were able to make their way to places like Vienna, Austria, and eventually to Israel or to the United States.
Right. So the big question is, why do these 8,000 Jews still live in Iran?
They live. I kind of set them in three categories. There are those that are elderly. They are set in their ways. They're older. They do not want to leave the country for whatever reason. They are set in their ways. They think that the regime will not threaten them because they're older. And as a result, they remain there. They believe Iran is their home, and they don't think that life will get any better for them because of their old age, and sometimes they're sicker. Second category are those that are extremely poor. They say to themselves, we're pretty poverty-stricken. We don't really have much lives in America, in Iran, but at least we speak the language, we know the culture. This is our background, and again, they're playing Russian roulette, but they remain. And the last group are those that are fairly well off and affluent, and they believe that they can outlive the regime. They don't see a threat from the regime. They think that they can pay bribes to the thugs and the officials and really avoid any kind of persecution. But again, they're playing Russian roulette with their lives as well. And at any point, they could, easily be arrested. They could easily be executed. These are primarily the folks that still live there. It's a perplexing question, but they primarily fall into one of those three categories.
Right. And how do you that the Iranian regime has managed to control its image and sort of Western journalists or political groups like Code Pink into thinking that everything is great for Jews in Iran? I mean, one often reads articles saying, it's great and they're tolerated and this sort of thing.
I think it's because of the regime controlling Western media and free media into Iran. You cannot get into Iran unless the apparatus, the regime's apparatus, the regime's Ministry of Intelligence approves your visa as a journalist to enter the country. They will not allow any journalists to come into the country unless they're previously vetted and they know that the journalists will, quote unquote, follow their talking points, listen to what they say, report only what the regime allows them to report, and show footage that the regime only allows them to shoot. This Iranian regime is a very evil totalitarian regime. I don't like comparing the Iranian regime to other regimes, but kind of like North Korea or Stalinist Russia or Cuba, where the media is strictly controlled and outside media is strictly prohibited. So as a result, the Iranian regime is able to control to some extent their image and project themselves as benevolent to the Jews and other religious minorities. Another aspect of this story, which is really painful, is the fact that American and European and West are lazy or indifferent, and they never challenge the regime. They never ask or report on what is truly happening when they leave Iran. An example of this came during the Soleimani funeral. A lot of Western and American journalists were allowed into Iran and they were reporting what was happening. But when they came out, they failed to, talk about the real story, what really happened. Instead, they just repeated the talking points of the regime and, were essentially propaganda props carrying the regime's propaganda. So it goes both ways. It's both the regime controlling the message and also Western journalists either being indifferent or playing along with the regime's demands.
So why is the regime so obsessed with Holocaust denial and defending Holocaust deniers, in your opinion?
A big part of it has to do with their obsession with hating Israel. The regime's thinking is, unfortunately, it's incorrect thinking, but their thinking is that Israel was established because the world and Europe felt sorry for the Jews and gave them this, homeland, gave Palestine to them as a homeland. And if only the Holocaust, then the reasoning for giving the Jews the land of Israel could also be denied and reversed. It's a very perverse version of thinking. The second reason of their obsession with Holocaust denial is the fact that this regime is they have a deep, deep-rooted hatred of the Jews. And anytime the Jews are shown in any kind of sympathetic way, they want to oppose that. They don't want the Jews to gain any kind of image of sympathy from the world. They want to project the Jews as the devil and the Jews as forces of evil. So by attacking the Holocaust and claiming that it's a myth, they can demonize the Jews and really demonize Israel.
It's said that the people of Iran are not anti-Semitic, just the regime. Do you agree?
To some extent, I do agree. The vast majority of Iranians in Iran and outside of Iran do not hate Jews. They don't hate Israel. They, for the most part, are tolerant and respectful. There is a small segment which is following the regime and vehemently anti-Semitic. They're religiously following the regime's form of radical Shiite Islam and think the Jews are, the devil and everything horrible under the sun. But the vast majority do not have anything against the Jews. They have a lot of respect for Jews, for Israel. They're indifferent, and they don't really have hate for anyone.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think the impact of the coronavirus has been on the regime? I mean, is it teetering on the brink of collapse, or what do you think? Are the Ayatollahs likely to fall?
Okay, before I answer that question, I think you guys stopped my video. I don't know if you're able to start it again. I wasn't able to.
I can start it now. We stopped it because to give you more bandwidth.
Yeah.
The sound was very weak. It was fading away. That's
it was
why I did it.
purely to give you more bandwidth, Karmel.
Oh, okay.
Put it back. Yeah.
It's on now.
It's on now.
Yeah, there we go.
Hi.
So, as far as the coronavirus, I cannot say whether it's going to cause the regime to collapse or not. It has created a lot of havoc in the country. Unfortunately, the regime has brought in many of the Chinese from Wuhan to Iran, I think intentionally, to spread the virus and infect Iranians that were protesting in the streets against the regime in a way to occupy the people and have their minds focused on trying to stay alive rather than protest against the regime. So it has hurt the regime. I cannot say whether it will cause the regime to collapse or not. Sanctions have, without a doubt, had a huge impact on hurting the regime and its power within Iran.
Mm-hmm. Right, and my last question really is, has any Jew ever been compensated for loss, for instance?
Never. The Jews in Iran have never received any kind of payment from the regime for the crimes that the regime has committed, for the millions, or I should say billions in dollars of assets that the regime has confiscated from the Jews. There may have been individual instances where some families may have been able to get some kind of quote unquote blood money from the regime for an individual that might have been accidentally killed by some actions from the government, but the vast majority have not received any kind of compensation from this Islamic regime in Iran.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'll just have a look and see what questions have been asked on the chat line, in the chat room. Hang on one second. Have we got any good questions? I think Harold asked whether families in Iran, Jewish families, can trace their ancestry back to biblical tribes. I mean, is there, do you have those sort of links with the Bible, for instance? What was it again, Harold? Can you ask that question?
I'm muted. Have you unmuted me?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
yes, I can hear you.
There are traditions. I spent some time in Iran. I went to university there for a bit. There are some traditions among Iranian Jews that they're from this particular tribe, Binyamin Ephraim. I remember. I've heard a few.
Yeah.
I simply remember those. And the question is, in his family, did he have any? Does he know anybody else who has these traditions? Because if we can get someone from the male line who has this tradition, we should be able to figure out the male ancestry of that particular tribe. Because it's unbelievable what we're able to do with the DNA. I, for example, am a Litvak, Lithuanian Jew. From Sicily 600 years before that, France, Spain, and 2,000 years ago, DNA can do these things. It's unbelievable. Getting better and better. That's why I'm asking the question.
Personally, my family doesn't have any information of tracing back to our, ancient Jewish tribal background personally, but there are some families that are Iranian Jewish families that are have information that they can trace back to the tribe of Benjamin. I think the tribe of Ephraim, as you mentioned. There are a couple of Mashhadi families. These are the Jews from Mashhad that live in Israel and live in Long Island in New York that can trace, or they claim that they can trace their ancestry back to those tribes. I've heard Benjamin and Ephraim. I've also heard of Manasseh as well. But again, there's no way to verify that. There's no way to... Maybe by analysis.
Here's the thing. If there are people on the male line knows this, there are Jews who are doing all sorts of fascinating DNA research, and if they would participate, wonderful things could happen here. It really connects us to our ancient history and what we are. We are one people, that's for sure. The DNA shows that. But this would give way back when we converged. And for example, you mentioned that during the first, after the first temple was destroyed, actually even before, with the northern kingdom being destroyed, if it's Benjamin, it could be the south or the north. Ephraim would definitely be the north, the northern kingdom. That's 784 or so before the Common Era.
Perhaps.
And that's why if we could get people like that to test, and I'm sure it can be funded, it isn't the problem.
I'd like to ask Madeleine Cohen to say something now. Madeleine, you're on.
Thank you. I'm interested in knowing something about the basic pre-persecution cultural heritage of the Iranian Jews. In other words, what language before say in the time of the Shah, what language did they speak? Hebrew? Did they speak Farsi? What language did they speak? Did they produce a literature? Did they produce poetry? What was the background cultural milieu before it would have been suppressed by the Ayatollahs?
Did you hear that, Karmel?
Yes. The language that the Jews in Iran or ancient Persia spoke was primarily a Judeo-Persian language. It was a mixture of Hebrew and Farsi, dating back for centuries. And they spoke that Judeo-Persian language, I would say, up until the earlier 20th century. The letters for that language were written in Hebrew letters, but the words were a mixture of Farsi and Hebrew. It's known as Judeo-Persian. And there are quite a number of books in Judeo-Persian, a number of very well-known poets and literature and Jewish commentary on the Torah. I don't remember them offhand, but they do exist. They just haven't been disseminated into English or Hebrew as widely as they should be. And they're phenomenal. Some of those commentaries in Judeo-Persian rival, and this is what I've been told, I can't read Judeo-Persian myself, but they rival the commentaries of Rashi and Rambam. My hope is that the academics that can read Judeo-Persian will translate that and share that with the rest of the world and with the Jewish world.
Right, and somebody's just commented, I think it's Yaska, who said that, of course, the Kurdish, the Iranian Kurds, Kurdish Jews in the north, I think, do speak Aramaic. Isn't that right? And are there any left?
The Kurdish Jews speak Aramaic. You have different, Judeo Persian dialects. You have Jews that live in that region between Turkey and Iran. They speak Turkish dialect. So I don't really, I'm not an expert in the linguistics, but yes, they do exist.
Okay, as Lynn's husband, can I ask one question? If they're in Iran, would the Iranian Jews go back to Iran if there was a change of regime?
Oh, that's a difficult question to answer. Yes, some would return without a doubt. They would return because they love that country. Iran is a part of their DNA. They love the country. They love the language. They love the history. Iran is a part of them. There's a lot of pride with being Iranian. But I think the vast majority of Iranian Jews would not go back to Iran if the regime collapsed to live. They may go back to visit, but not to live, because they've really established, fairly good lives for themselves and freedom in Europe, in Israel, and the United States.
I think on that note, we will bring this session to a close. I'd like to thank you so much, Karmel. That was so informative and wonderful. I'd like to thank Jemena for partnering us in organizing this. I'd like to thank all those of you who joined us from the States, and all our regular watchers and listeners. Please do sign up to the Harif website if you're not already there to find out about more of our exciting lockdown lectures. Until then, I wish you a good evening. Stay well, stay safe, and see you next time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone's on YouTube.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining. Hope to see you again
Can't
soon.
see the pictures.
Yes.
Lynn?
Yeah.
Do me a favor, give me a call when you have a chance, okay?
Sure. I haven't got your number, Harold.
I'll write it right now in the whatever. Call me on WhatsApp.
Right. Or just email me. Yeah.
Do you see it there?
Yes, I'm still here, Harold.
Oh.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I heard a lot about you.
Who are you? Who's talking?
I think, is it Carmel talking?
Karmel?
Who's talking?
You're somehow related to Rukhsar. Is that right?
Rukhsar.